Hello and welcome to the Fashion Capital Fabric Studio and our online shop. But selling fabrics is just a small part of what we do here. We are also a not-for-profit manufacturing company based in London, UK. Here we make garments for well-known brands such as ASOS, M&S and Harrods, as well as helping small start-up companies create their first collections. Another important part of our work is our Fashion Technology Academy, where students learn to sew and cut patterns to industry standards. My name's Alice and I work in the pattern cutting studio, and I also teach in the Fashion Technology Academy. We've made these videos to inspire you to get creative and support you through the sewing process. Our first video is going to introduce you to the sewing machine, how to thread it up and how to make it work. So first things first, whether you're going out to buy a new sewing machine or dusting off your mother's old one from the attic, it's very helpful to understand the basics of how it all works. There's lots of different makes of sewing machines. This one is called Husqvarna, which, as it sounds, is a Swedish make. What's important is to buy the best quality that you can, but buy a simple sewing machine of a good quality rather than one with lots of bells and whistles, but it isn't very good quality. If you're buying a new sewing machine, and especially if you go to a shop to buy it rather than buy it online, you should get a basic introduction as to how to make it work, and it'll come with an instruction manual. If you're dusting off an old machine and you've lost the instruction book, you can usually go online and download a PDF with all the instructions. So let's have a look at some of the different buttons and bits of the sewing machine before we thread it up. So up here, this is where you wind the bobbin, which is the underneath thread on the sewing machine. This is the spool for the cotton. So the cotton goes on here. Mine's got a second spike here in case you want to do a double thread. We'll have a look at that later. This little button here is a tension spring. So when you wind the thread around the sewing machine, this one doesn't, but they often have numbers to guide you around. This thread will eventually come down here and into the needle, and that's what will give you the nice, is the tension spring, and this will help when you thread up the machine to keep the stitch nice and straight and even. There's a couple of different buttons here which are to set the tension, which will be different depending on what sort of fabric you're using. I'm lucky this machine has a little computer panel which I can press different buttons and will advise me on to which tension to use. This one is the pressure of the foot, which gives you a different pressure for sewing very light or very heavy fabrics. Some machines are more simple, some are more complicated, but if you set it up for medium fabric in the first place according to your instruction book, that will certainly do to get you up and running. If you look down here, this is the needle part where not to get your fingers under. Down here is the all-important needle where the actual stitching happens, and the foot, which is just here, which will hold your fabric in place while you're stitching. You get a variety of different feet which will work for different kinds of sewing, but for just straight sewing you can use the same one all the time. This in here is the bobbin, which is the under thread of the machine. It's very important that you thread this the right way around or you'll get a nasty mash of threads instead of a nice neat line of sewing. This is the needle, which on most modern machines has the eye pointing straight towards you. On older machines sometimes the needle eye is sideways, so just make sure that you have put it in the right way for your machine or it won't work very well. There's lots of different types of needles. There's a universal needle which will work for most woven fabrics, lots of different sizes. So if you're sewing a fine fabric, use a size 8 or a size 10. Most fabrics are 12 will be perfect, but if you're sewing something thick and heavy like denim, you might want to do a 14. There are also specialized needles for different fabrics. There's a double needle, so you can get a double stitching to make nice straight rows of double stitching if you're sewing something like denim and you want a jeans kind of look. You can change the needle with this screw here. So let's have a look at some threads for sewing on the machine. This one is a standard polyester thread. It has a little bit of spring to it, which means you can sew quite fast without it breaking. It's always worth spending a bit more money and buying a good quality, because it'll be nice and smooth and there won't be any danger of it snapping halfway through a complicated seam. It's also worth investing for some standard colours on bigger size rolls. This is a special thread for sewing jeans, so you can see it's a bit thicker, so it'll show up more when you're sewing top stitching. It's also good for sewing something like if you're sewing handles on a bag or something like that, because it's nice and strong. There is also special thread for silk thread for sewing silk fabrics, quilting thread for quilting fabrics. But if you've only got this one, that's fine. You can do most things with that, and you can also sew two together, and that will make your thread on the top a little bit thicker. All modern sewing machines work with two threads, one on top and one underneath. And the underneath one is called the bobbin, and the bobbin will be a little spool looking something like this, and it pops on there and connects in order to wind it. Let's have some pink thread. So the thread goes on here. This will give the tension around this loop around here, and wind around a few times just to get started. Every machine's a little bit different, but it's usually obvious the route you should take, or just have a look in your instruction manual. So we press the pressure foot, you'll see the bobbin fills with the thread. So now you've got a bobbin wound with thread, we can put it into the bobbin case. Some sewing machines will have a separate bobbin case, but newer ones it's usually built in to the sewing machine. But the principle is the same, and it's vital that you put the thread in the right way round, or you will not be getting any kind of a nice stitch at all. So first of all, just pop the top off, and then what's important here is that the bobbin thread loops around and pulls backwards onto this little hook here in the bobbin case. So it's going this way and then pulling backwards. And in my machine there's another little hook here and one here just to hold the thread in place. Then you can put the top back on and wind the top part. Now I'm going to thread the top part of the machine. So I'll first of all put the thread on the spool, and then I'm going to take it around this little button here, which has a spring behind it, which gives the tension. And then on my machine there's little arrows to show you which way to go. Sometimes some machines have numbers. So this is going to go around the tension here, up through the slot here, over the hook and back, and there's a little hook through here, and now to thread the needle. And then if you lift the foot There'll be a lever at the back to lift the foot, poke it through behind, and this is called the flywheel. If you twist this and pull, the thread will come through from underneath. You can tuck them both out of the way behind. Now we're ready to sew. It's always a good idea to just start on a test piece of fabric, just to make sure that everything's set up properly and that the stitch length is appropriate for what fabric you're sewing with. I've got a number 3 stitch length here. Again, different machines have slightly different knobs and levers for setting the stitch length. Mine has some little buttons here, so I can make the stitch smaller or bigger depending on what I'm sewing. But generally speaking, the finer the fabric, the smaller the stitch length. This is quite coarse, so I'm going to start with a stitch 3. I'm going to put my fabric under the machine, put down the pressure foot to hold it in place, and put my foot on the foot pedal to make the machine work. So first of all, a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches in reverse, and then sew the seam, and when you get to the end, reverse again for a couple of stitches, lift the foot pedal, lift the needle out of the fabric so you don't break it, and you can pull the fabric away, and usually somewhere there's a little cutter. Sometimes it's on the post here, mine's on the back of the machine, and you can cut the threads off.